Hi and welcome to this video. So over the last few months, we at Swim Wales have been supporting the swimming community by releasing a host of information which has provided ideas for your land-based training. We first of all released the drill progression series. We then followed that up with a collection of movement flows which were specific to each stroke, and these movement flows encompassed all the exercises, or many of the exercises, that you could find within the drill progression series. Now for those coaches amongst you, what we're going to do within this video is we're going to take that a step further, and we're going to provide you with some simple guidelines of which is going to allow you to start to build and sequence together your own movement flows. We will firstly discuss a couple of simple methods for which to provide a framework or structure for the design of the movement flow. This framework will give you an idea as to which exercises or positions to begin the flow with, to transition and make up the middle portion of your flow design, and then which will be your peak poses, the positions that you finish the flow with. Secondly, we will look at the movements that are frequently used as the transition movements, which will take you from position to position within the flow. And these transition positions are key in providing some fun, and also helps to cultivate some creativity within the movement flow. And then thirdly, finally, we'll discuss volume and intensity of the movement flow. So how many repetitions you should be completing, and how much time you should be spending within each position. When designing a movement flow, there are two methods that can be used to help provide a structure or framework for that movement flow plan design. Now the first method is a task-specific approach. This is when a swimmer is being prepared for a very specific task. Now an example of this would be, in our most recent videos, we've released movement flows which have targeted the breaststroke, butterfly, backstroke and freestyle drill progressions. Now a task-specific approach will be targeting a number of muscle groups over multiple joints, and that will be specific to the task. So if we're looking at freestyle, if you go back and look at the freestyle movement flow, you'll see that the thoracic spine around the hips, particularly through the hip flexors, and around the ankles are areas which are mobilized, and this is specific to the freestyle stroke. Now there is the second method, which is the muscle group specific approach, and this is a flow which is largely designed around one or a limited number of muscle groups. Once it has been decided whether the framework is going to be a task-specific or a muscle group-specific approach, the next stage is to sequence together into a methodical order the exercises that are going to be used within the movement flow. Now whether you're using a task-specific or a muscle group-specific approach, this can be considered to be done in the same way. And just to paint a picture, if you can imagine a continuum, and on one side of that continuum you have low skill, low demand movements. This is where you begin your movement flow. So a little example to this would be a seated position. Then as you build through that continuum, increase in demand and skill up to your peak pose, which will be your high skill positions or your high demand poses, this is where you would finish the flow. Now just to give an example, if you look back through the freestyle movement flow video that I've done, you'll see that I begin the movement flow in a seated position. And the seated position that I'm using is the thunderbolt pose. I go through, transition through from this position into a kneeling position, and the exercise I'm using is a low lunge. The flow then takes me through into a standing high lunge position or split squat. and then the movement flow is finished in a high skill position with my peak pose, which is a arabesque, which is a single leg balance. Now, even though I take the flows, this is why I consider the flow to be finished, but I often will take the flows back down to the floor, and I will continue the session with some additional core exercises. Now, I do perform core or trunk exercises within the flow. However, I don't perform too much, because the more fatigue that you will get within the core, it will compromise those peak positions. So once I've completed the flow, I will often take the swimmer or the participant down to the floor and continue to work on trunk exercises. Now, you do not need to begin your flows in this sequence. You don't have to have your swimmers or participants beginning seated on a ground-based position. I will often start my flows in standing. However, you must always make sure that you begin or you design the sequence in order of your exercises from a low skill, low demand position or exercise, and work through to the high skill, high demand positions. This will allow your swimmer or participant time to build up and warm up ready to perform at their best for that peak pose. As has already been mentioned, the sequencing of exercises for both the task specific and the muscle group specific approach are done in the same way, beginning with a low skill, low demand movement or exercise, and building through up into a high skill, high demand movement or exercise. To give an example of a muscle group specific plan or design, I'd like you to consider this approach for targeting the hamstrings. Now, as you can see in this video, the participant is beginning on the ground in a low skill, low demand position, and they're performing an active straight leg raise targeting the hamstrings. Now, within the flow, there would be a series of movements which would take the participant into a kneeling position, which you can see here. They are performing a runner's hamstring stretch. Now, this is adding a little bit more complexity as there's a bit more balance required. This would then be further developed through a series of movements to bring the participant into a standing position, or where they'll perform a dynamic hip hinge movement. This is adding further complexity and demand into the exercise. This exercise is then further developed by continuing with the same movement, but simply bringing it onto one leg, so performing a single leg hip hinge movement. This is preparing the participant for that final peak pose, which is going to be a single leg balance or an arabesque. And this is where the movement flow will finish. Once the exercise selection has been put into a methodical order, the next stage is to consider your transition positions or transition movements. Now, this is where, as a coach, you get to cultivate some creative design around your movement flow program. This is where you get to instill some fun into the flow for your swimmers. Now, there are some basic principles that I'd like you to consider. The first position is going to be going from a seated position through to a kneeling 4-point position. The next position you'll need to be aware of is going from a 4-point position, such as a downward dog, and that'll go through to a low lunge or a kneeling position. The next position will be taking you from a standing and taking you through into a hip hinged or ground based position. And then there will also be that in reverse, where you go from the ground or a hip hinge position and then come through to standing. I personally like to add additional exercises into the transition phase. This adds complexity and creativity into the flow, which ultimately adds to the interest for the swimmer. In this example, you'll see the participant going from a 4-point position, where the objective is to get to the ground for their next exercise. The transition phase will move them from the 4-point position into a matrix, and from the matrix they will lower their hips down to the ground of where they get to move into and explore the next pose. This is just one example of many ways of where you can add exercises into the transition phase. The final stage in developing your movement flow program design is the correct prescription of volume for your repetitions of key exercises and time spent in each of the key poses. Now, a good starting point is to perform for the key exercises or key poses no more than 10 seconds in each position, and repeating that key position for 1 or 2 sets within the flow. As the swimmer or participant becomes more comfortable and competent at performing that key exercise, then extending the volume of work up to 40 seconds being held in each position, and repeating that position for up to 4 repetitions. I hope you found this brief video helpful, and for the coaches amongst us, I hope it's given you some ideas and some confidence for you to go away and begin to develop some of your own movement flow sessions. Now, before you begin that journey, I would strongly recommend that you look back through the exercises that are provided within the Swim Wales Drill Progressions framework, and I'll have that form the body of exercises that you initially use to start developing your own movement flows. Also, look back through the more recent videos of where I've put together flows using the exercise using the Drill Progressions framework, and that will give you some ideas around how to sequence those exercises together. So thank you very much all for watching this video, and I hope you found it useful.